There's a vegetable that tastes better than asparagus, has more nutrients than broccoli, and packs more vitamin C than oranges. You plant it once, and it produces food for 20 years. No replanting, no annual seeds. Just harvest after harvest, year after year, for 2 decades. Victorian gardeners called it the vegetable of kings. Thomas Jefferson grew it at Monticello. European chefs consider it a delicacy worth more per pound than prime steak. And almost no one in America has ever heard of it. This isn't some exotic tropical plant that only grows in Yunnan rainforests. It's not genetically modified. It's not even particularly difficult to grow. In fact, once established, it's nearly indestructibly laughs at frost, shrugs off drought, and keeps producing while everything else in your garden is struggling. So, why did we forget about it? Why did one of the most productive, nutritious, and delicious perennial vegetables nearly disappear from American gardens? And more importantly, how can you grow it yourself? This is the story of sea kale, the forgotten superfood that could change how you think about gardening. Because what I'm about to show you challenges everything modern agriculture taught us about growing food. Let me start with a question that nobody asks. Why do we replant our gardens every single year? Think about it. Every spring, gardeners across America are out there tilling soil, buying seeds, starting seedlings, transplanting, and basically rebuilding their entire vegetable garden from scratch. Tomatoes, annual replant every year. Lettuce, annual replant every year. Beans, annual replant every year. Peppers, technically perennial, but we treat them as annuals. Replant every year. We've been conditioned to think this is normal. This is just how gardening works. You plant in spring, harvest in summer and fall, everything dies in winter, and you start over next year. But here's what nobody tells you. This is exhausting, it's expensive, and it's completely unnecessary for a huge portion of what we could be growing. There's an entire category of vegetables that you plant once and harvest for years, sometimes decades. Asparagus is the famous example. Plant it once, and you can harvest for 15 to 25 years. Rhubarb, 30 years or more. Artichokes, 10 to 15 years. These are called perennial vegetables, and they've been the backbone of productive gardens for thousands of years. But modern agriculture pushed them aside. Why? Because annuals are better for business. Seed companies want you buying seeds every year. Chemical companies want you buying fertilizer every year. The entire system is designed around annual crops that require constant inputs. Perennial vegetables don't fit that model. You buy the plant once, or grow it from seed once, and then it just keeps producing. There's no recurring revenue, no annual seed sales, no continuous fertilizer dependency. So they quietly disappeared from seed catalogs, garden centers, and eventually from our collective memory. But they never stopped working. And the best of them, the absolute champion of perennial vegetables, is sea kale. Let me tell you what makes this plant so extraordinary. Sea kale, scientifically known as Crambe maritima, is native to the coastal regions of Europe. It grows wild on beaches from the Black Sea to the Atlantic coast of Britain, thriving in conditions that would kill most vegetables: salt spray, sandy soil, fierce winds, and temperature extremes. This is a plant that evolved to survive, and that toughness translates directly into your garden. But survival isn't what makes sea kale special. What makes it special is that it's delicious. Imagine asparagus, but meatier, with a slightly nutty flavor and a hint of the ocean. Now imagine that asparagus had the texture of the most tender broccoli stem you've ever eaten. That's sea kale. When it's young and blanched, that means grown into darkness, so it stays white and tender. Sea kale shoots are considered one of the finest vegetables in European cuisine. High-end restaurants in London, Paris, and Copenhagen serve it as a seasonal delicacy. Often at prices that rival expensive cuts of meat, the flavor is complex. There's a sweetness, a subtle bitterness like you'd find in quality greens, and an umami quality that makes it incredibly satisfying. It's rich without being heavy, delicate without being bland. You can eat it like asparagus steamed with butter and lemon. You can roast it. You can saute it with garlic. You can add it to stir fries. You can even eat the young leaves raw in salads, where they add a pleasant, slightly spicy kick, similar to arugula. And here's the beautiful part. Unlike asparagus, which has a relatively short harvest season, sea kale produces over a longer period. You can harvest shoots in early spring, then leaves through the summer, then more shoots in fall if conditions are right. One plant, multiple harvest windows, incredible flavor, and it does this for 20 years or more. But flavor is just the beginning. Let's talk about nutrition, because this is where sea kale really starts to shine. The nutritional profile of sea kale is genuinely impressive. We're talking about a vegetable that was traditionally eaten specifically for its health benefits. Long before we had the science to understand why it worked, let's start with vitamin C. Sea kale contains significantly more vitamin C than oranges, ounce for ounce. We're talking about roughly 60 to 70 milligrams per 100 grams, compared to about 50 milligrams in oranges. That's important because vitamin C isn't just about preventing scurvy. It's crucial for immune function, skin health, wound healing, and it acts as a powerful antioxidant that protects your cells from damage. Now, let's talk about glucosilates. These are sulfur-containing compounds found in cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cabbage, and kale. Sea kale is absolutely loaded with glucosinolates. In fact, it contains higher concentrations than many of its more famous relatives. These compounds have been extensively studied, and research suggests they may help protect against certain cancers, reduce inflammation, and support the body's natural detoxification systems. Sea kale also provides excellent amounts of calcium, iron, and potassium. The calcium content is particularly notable. It rivals that of many dairy products. For people looking to increase calcium intake without consuming dairy, sea kale is an outstanding option. And it's rich in fiber, which supports digestive health and helps regulate blood sugar levels. But here's what really sets sea kale apart from other vegetables. Its mineral density is extraordinarily high because it evolved in coastal environments. Plants that grow near the ocean tend to accumulate trace minerals from sea spray and salt-enriched soil. Sea kale brings that mineral richness into your garden. So when I say it's better than broccoli, asparagus, and oranges combined, I'm not exaggerating. It literally provides nutritional benefits from all three in one incredibly hardy, long-lived plant. And yet, if you walk into a typical American grocery store, you won't find it. If you ask at a typical garden center, they'll look at you like you're speaking a foreign language. So what happened? How did such an incredible vegetable become so obscure? The story of sea kale's decline is really the story of how we industrialized food production and what we lost in the process. In the 18th and 19th centuries, sea kale was extremely popular in Britain and parts of Europe. Wealthy estates cultivated it extensively. The famous Scottish botanist William Curtis wrote about forcing sea kale growing it in darkness to produce those tender white shoots in 1799. Market gardens around London grew it commercially. Thomas Jefferson, America's gardening president, was introduced to sea kale during his time in Europe and brought seeds back to Monticello. He grew it successfully and considered it one of his favorite vegetables. Early American seed catalogs featured sea kale. Gardening books from the 1800s included detailed instructions for cultivation. It was on its way to becoming a staple of American gardens. But then, several things happened that pushed it into obscurity. First, the rise of industrial agriculture favored annual crops that could be mechanized. Sea kale, as a perennial that requires some skill to harvest and prepare, didn't fit the model of large-scale production. You can't plant thousands of acres of sea kale, harvest it with machines, and ship it across the country as easily as you can with lettuce or carrots. Second, refrigeration and transportation technology made it possible to ship tropical fruits and vegetables year-round. Suddenly, the foods that had been winter and early spring, staples like sea kale, which produces in early spring when fresh vegetables were traditionally scarce, became less critical. You could just buy asparagus from Peru or broccoli from California. But third, and perhaps most importantly, the seed industry consolidated. Small regional seed companies that carried unusual varieties were bought up by larger corporations. The focus shifted to crops that sold in high volumes. Vegetables that required a paragraph of explanation in the catalog quietly disappeared. Sea kale required a paragraph of explanation. It was unfamiliar to most American gardeners. It took a year or two to establish before producing significant harvests. It needed a permanent spot in the garden, not a rotating annual bed, so it got dropped from catalogs. Without commercial availability, fewer people grew it. Without people growing it, it became even less commercially viable. It was a downward spiral into obscurity. By the mid-20th century, sea kale had essentially vanished from American gardens. It survived in a few specialty gardens, in the collections of plant enthusiasts, and in the wild coastal areas of Europe where it had always grown. But it never stopped being an incredible vegetable. It never stopped producing for 20 years from a single planting. It never stopped being more nutritious than the vegetables that replaced it. It was just forgotten until recently, when a small but growing number of gardeners, chefs, and food advocates started asking a simple question. What vegetables did we use to grow that we stopped growing, and should we bring them back? Sea kale is at the top of that list. Let me tell you what it's actually like to grow sea kale, because this is where it gets really interesting. First, you need to understand that sea kale is almost absurdly tough. Remember, this is a plant that evolved on beaches. It's adapted to conditions that would stress most garden vegetables to death. Cold, sea kale is fully winter hardy too, at least -15 degrees Fahrenheit and probably colder. It goes dormant in winter and comes roaring back in spring. Frost doesn't bother it at all. It's not as heat-loving as, say, tomatoes, but it handles summer heat better than you'd expect for a plant that prefers cooler weather. In hot climates, it may slow down in peak summer, but it doesn't die, just waits for cooler weather and starts growing again. Drought. The deep taproot we're-talking roots that can go down 3 feet or more means sea kale can access water that shallow-rooted annuals never reach. Once established, it rarely needs supplemental watering, except in extreme drought. Poor soil. Sea kale tolerates sandy, rocky, low-fertility soil that would leave most vegetables stunted and struggling. It actually prefers well-drained soil and can rot in heavy, waterlogged clay, but give it decent drainage and it's happy in soil that's far from ideal. Salt. This is the really wild part. Sea kale actually tolerates salt spray and salt-enriched soil. If you live in a coastal area where salt is a gardening challenge, sea kale is one of the few vegetables that doesn't care. Pests and diseases, remarkably resistant. The glucosinolates that make it nutritious for us make it less appealing to many pests. Deer generally avoid it. Rabbits aren't particularly interested. It can get some cabbage family pests like aphids or cabbage worms, but infestations are rarely severe. So you've got this plant that's tough, resilient, and low maintenance. What does that mean for you as a gardener? It means you plant it once, in a spot with decent drainage and full sun to partial shade, and then it basically takes care of itself for the next 20 years. Compare that to tomatoes, which need staking, pruning, constant watering, fertilizing, and pest management, and still might get blight and die before you get a harvest. Or lettuce, which bolts in heat, needs consistent moisture, and requires replanting every few weeks if you want continuous harvest. Or pretty much any annual vegetable, which demands attention and inputs throughout the growing season. See, kale just grows. You harvest it in spring. Maybe you give it some compost or fertilizer once a year if you're feeling generous. And it keeps producing. This is what perennial vegetables do. They work with you instead of requiring you to work constantly for them. But here's the technique that takes sea kale from interesting perennial vegetable to absolute garden superstar. Forcing is the traditional method of producing those incredibly tender, sweet, blanched shoots that European chefs prize so highly, and it's easier than you might think. Here's the basic idea. In late winter or early spring, just as the plant is beginning to wake up from dormancy, you cover it with something that blocks light. This could be a specialized sea kale pata, beautiful terracotta bell, with a removable lid that Victorian gardeners used, or it could be a large bucket, or a big clay pot, or even a wooden box. You cover the emerging shoots completely, blocking out all light. What happens next is pure plant biology. The shoots, trying to reach light, grow tall, and etiolated, stretched out and pale. Without light, they don't produce chlorophyll, so instead of turning green, they stay white or pale yellow. This blanching has several effects. The shoots become incredibly tender because they're not developing the tough fibers that come with exposure to light. They become sweeter because the plant is mobilizing stored starches and converting them to sugars to fuel this rapid growth. And they develop a delicate, complex flavor that's completely different from the green shoots. After about 4 to 6 weeks under cover, you lift the pot or bucket, and there you'll find a cluster of pale asparagus-like shoots ready to harvest. Cut them. And this is important too. Then remove the cover and let the plant green up and photosynthesize normally for the rest of the season. This allows it to rebuild its energy reserves for next year. One plant can typically be forced once per year without harm. Some gardeners with multiple plants will force them in rotation, so they have blanched shoots available for a longer season. The forced shoots are the absolute pinnacle of sea kale's culinary potential. They're what fancy restaurants serve. They're what food writers rhapsodize about. But here's the secret. Even without forcing, sea kale is delicious and worth growing. The green shoots and young leaves are still excellent eating. Forcing just takes it to another level. And remember, this is a plant you establish once. After that, forcing it is just a matter of putting a bucket over it in late winter. We're not talking about complicated techniques or expensive equipment. This is accessible to any gardener. So if growing it is this easy, and it's this productive, and it's this delicious and nutritious, why aren't more people doing it? Honestly, the main reason is simply that they don't know about it. Here's my challenge to you, and I want you to take this seriously. This season, find sea kale seeds or crowns. Plant them. Give them a good spot with decent drainage and sun. Water them while they establish, then step back and let them do their thing. Don't expect miracles in year one. Don't get discouraged if they're slow. Perennials always are. But commit to those plants for the long term. Tend them, protect them, give them a chance to show you what they can do. And in 3 years, when you're harvesting shoots that taste better than asparagus from plants you barely have to maintain, you'll understand what we lost when we abandoned perennial vegetables. You'll understand why Thomas Jefferson grew sea kale at Monticello. You'll understand why Victorian gardeners built special forcing pots just for this one plant. You'll understand why European chefs still consider it a delicacy worth seeking out. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start looking at your garden differently. You'll start asking what else we used to grow that we should bring back. You'll start thinking about perennials instead of always annuals. You'll start building a garden that gets better with age instead of starting from zero every spring. Because sea kale isn't just a forgotten vegetable. It's a doorway to a different way of thinking about food. The plant that grows for 20 years produces food better than what you can buy, requires almost no maintenance, and thrives in conditions that would stress most vegetables to death. That plant is telling us something important. It's telling us that nature already figured out sustainable food production. We just need to pay attention. So plant sea kale, give it 3 years, and see what happens. I think you'll discover what generations of gardeners before us knew. The best vegetables are the ones you plant once and harvest for decades. That's not just smart gardening. That's food security. That's resilience. That's working with nature instead of constantly fighting against it. Sea kale has been waiting for us to remember it. Maybe it's time we did.